Hey guys, welcome and thank you so much for tuning in to this edition of Free Thinking with Montel. My guest today, catapulted from foster home, orphanages, and a meager beginnings to become a mega successful Wall Street executive. In 2015, he received the Horatio Alger Award, given to Americans who exemplify the values of initiative, leadership, and commitment to excellence, and who have succeeded despite personal adversities. He's the author of the critically acclaimed memoir, On the Road Less Traveled, and is here today to talk about his latest book, his new book, The Island of the Four Ps, a modern fable about preparing for your future. Ed, Hajim, thank you so much for being a part of the show today. Thanks for tuning in to Free Thinking with Montel.
Montel, thank you for having me.
Absolutely, sir. Look, before we delve into your new book, let's talk a little bit about your childhood, and which is really just remarkable. I mean, kidnapped by a father at the age of 3, told that your mother was dead, was bounced around from foster homes to orphanages, yet you still have become the success that you have. So let's go back. Talk me a little bit about that life. I mean, and that's one thing about the fact that if you do get the copy of your book, and I'm hoping that all of my listeners do, the book is called The Island of the Four Ps, a modern fable about preparing for your future. Ed goes into a little bit of detail in the last chapters is a book about his early childhood years. But tell him a little bit about it right now, sir.
Well, it almost reads like fiction. That's what people say. My father was an immigrant and did extremely well. Lost everything in the 29-33 crash. And as he said, he was in New York City. He decided either to commit suicide or drive to California. And he decided, I'm thankful that he drove to California and met my mother on the way, married her in 2 weeks. They went on to California. The streets weren't paved with gold, which he thought they were in those days. And I was born 3 years later on my birth certificate to an unemployed father and a homemaker mother. Dad had demons from losing all his money and also being a Middle Eastern sort of man, and treated my mother very badly. 3 years later, she said, I've had it. And she divorced my father, got custody of me completely. And he got $5 a week of alimony and child support and visiting rights on Sunday. But she lived in St. Louis, so she took me from Los Angeles to St. Louis. The first or second visiting time, Dad had to drive 1,800 miles in a 1936, Ford Roadster. Picked me up, and instead of taking me to the park, he got back on the road and Highway 66 and took me back to Los Angeles. Called my mother and told him not to look for us or else. And he told me subsequently that she died. This started a trip that ended up being, I lived with neighbors, and he was a radio operator aboard a merchant ship. So for the first couple of years, I lived with neighbors. When he came in town, we had a father-son relationship. But when the war started in 1941, I started 15 years of 5 foster homes, the YMCA on 34th Street. We moved back to the east, Coney Island hotel room, and then 2 orphanages. So it was a pretty bumpy road. But I tell people those disadvantages which I picked up during that period, in some respects, some of them anyway, became advantages in later life.
Well, one of the things that was very interesting, let's go back to that Coney Island thing, because that really, that hit me when I read that, about the fact that he left to go on his deployment. He prepaid your hotel in a Coney Island hotel. How old were you?
I was 11 years old, and the woman, Mrs. Bernstein, was going to take me in the middle of August when he was put aboard ship. And the last minute, she changed her mind. He came home to the hotel room and said, son, I've got to go aboard this ship. And Mrs. Bernstein's not going to take you for a month, a few weeks or a month, or whatever it was. And I've paid basically the hotel bill, and the hotel manager will take care of you. And I've paid for your meals at the local delicatessen, and here's some money, and be a good boy. And I'd learned that the summer before, I learned the subways, having lived in the YMCA on 34th Street, and so I knew the subways pretty well. And I was a Giant fan, and I would go to the Polo Grounds or go to a museum. And I'm lucky I usually get home before dark, because Coney Island in those days wasn't a great place, as you probably know. And come September, she wouldn't take me again. So he from the ocean or from the sea, he placed me in an orphanage in Far Rockaway, and I arrived there all alone. having moving from my hotel room where I had my own bathroom and so forth to an orphanage where 50 of us were in one room with a congregate bathroom and the whole works. Real change. But I was 11 years old, and I almost don't believe it myself today. But I got back and I got the letters, and I sat down and found the difference between facts and what I remember. It was very important to me to make sure I got as many of the facts online as possible because I
Well,
wanted to.
well, hold on a second. Let's get some of that straight too, because again, when the woman wouldn't take you in the second time, and he was at sea. Basically, it's almost as if your father just gave you up and said, "Okay, put him in an
Well,
orphanage."
he abandoned me 3 times. He abandoned me when I was 5 years old. I put me in a foster home, which was very difficult. And then again, he abandoned me again in 19 when he went to sea and when I was 11 years old. And then when I was 15 in the first orphanage, he disappeared completely, and I became a ward of the state. So he abandoned me again. And I didn't find out why he abandoned me the third time until 2000, and I guess it must have been 2012, when some of his papers came to the university, and some smart researcher said, "Here's what your father was doing back then." And it was a very ugly story, but he had basically abandoned me because he was suing the shipping company, and they were after him, and so forth and so on. It's a complicated story. He was supposedly they were trying to murder him, and he obviously couldn't handle me, so he just let me go. Luckily, I became a ward of the state, and some wonderful social worker woman found another orphanage for me because I had aged out of the first one, and it was a good one. It was in Yonkers, New York, about 4 blocks from an excellent high school, and that was my ticket out of the trouble I was in.
I mean, I gotta tell you something, Ed. I mean, for most people, this kind of adversity would have led to destructive behavior as an adult, destructive behavior as a teenager, as a kid. But what drove you to say, "I'm going to go ahead and get out of high school," not knowing whether you have any parents? You think your mother's dead. You have no parents. You decided to get out of high school, and you were determined to go to college. So explain that.
Now, Montel, I got a lot of advantages from my disadvantages, but one thing I was angry. I was an angry young man, because when you're put through, I was in 15 or 20 different places before I was 18 years old. You constantly look around and say, "Why me?" And that builds anger. But in my case, it built anger to make it happen. I was going to change. I was going to get out of this thing. Now, I did get good training in Catholic schools in Los Angeles when I was a little tyke. And basically, they put the golden rule in front of me and said, with the golden ruler, you're going to do right, because if you do right, you go to the right place. If you do wrong, you go to the other place. So I got that early. I got that very early. My father, by the way, even when he abandoned me, sent me messages constantly that I was the greatest, that I was right, I was going to do well. So, one ghostwriter wanted me to hate my father. I never hated my father. I loved my father. But those letters and whenever we saw each other, he supported me completely. He gave me unconditional love, although he gave me what he could give me. And then finally, I must admit, every Saturday we went to the movies. And in those days, there were heroes. There was John Wayne. There was, Jimmy Stewart. They always did the right thing. So those are the sort of three. By the way, I had to come up with this after I wrote the book because people like asking that question. And I wasn't sure why either. Why would I do that? But I found that those three pillars sort of pushed me. And then I looked around at this wonderful high school where 80% of the kids went to a private college. I said, if they go to private college and they're going to make it, then that's a reason that I should try to make it. Also, the second orphanage, the sort of headmaster of the second orphanage was a guy that was convinced that, not many of the kids went to a private college, but he pushed me to do that as well. So I had a mentor. And by the way, I didn't accept him very well. I didn't trust anybody in those days.
Well, now that's good, but at the same time, you don't have parents. So, I mean, I don't know how you thought you would find or come up with the resources to be able to go to college. I mean, how were you able to do that?
Well, in those days, see, that's why I think there's more opportunity today. There are very few scholarships, and I was convinced because I was going to get the New York State scholarship, and I didn't get it. But I applied for the NROTC scholarship, but there were only 1,200 given in the whole country, and I got it, and that gave me $50 a month, and books and tuition, and it allowed me to apply to 52 different colleges. Unfortunately, in those days, you can only apply to 3, and I applied to 3 schools, and 2 of the schools says with the NROTC scholarship, it's going to take 5 years. I didn't have the money for 4 years. I sure as I can do 5 years. University of Rochester said, we'll get you through in 4. So I went there. $50 a month didn't quite do the job, so I had to work for the whole 4 years, but I was still on my way. And the first year was really bumpy. because I arrived in a black leather jacket. I had the wrong hairstyle. I probably had the wrong, conversation. I got rejected by all the fraternities in the first week. You know, so it was a pretty bumpy start. But on the other hand, relative to the orphanage and being an orphan, I was in much better shape. So it was a better deal, even though it wasn't so good. And I decided, by the way, and the reason I wrote this book was that when I was 18, I buried my background. I didn't tell anybody. I didn't want any special privileges. I didn't want anybody. I was ashamed of my background. So when people asked me, where did you grow up? I said, basically, my father's a merchant marine. We live in a post office box in San Francisco. My mother died when I was 3. End of story. And a little bit of denial doesn't hurt because I didn't have to go constantly explaining it to everybody. And it worked out pretty well for me. But I was a little bit of a mystery because, and that caused problems in my freshman year as well. I didn't fit in as well, but I refused to tell people. And all my life, my wife didn't even know the whole story. My kids knew about half of it. And so when Horatio Alger and the University of Rochester pushed me for my background, then my kids jumped in, and so did my wife. Said, we've got to have it written down. And as I started to write it down, I started to learn a lot about myself that I really didn't know, which was shocking. And I must admit, I couldn't write my childhood. My daughter, who is a writer, works for TED Talks, basically wrote the first draft of my background after we laid all the letters out. My father saved all my letters. I saved all his letters. And so we finally got that first 18 years down, separating facts from what I remembered. But to me, the reason I've done this is that I want to convince young people that anything is possible.
You you went ahead and graduated. What was your degree in?
Pardon?
So when you
What?
graduated, what was your degree in?
I got my degree in chemical engineering. I was good in math and science, so there's a little bit of a gene problem. I was good in math and science, and you get those days. If you're an engineer, you got a job. So I worked very hard to become a chemical engineer. It was very difficult in those days. We started with 60, and only 6 of us graduated on time. Eventually, 15 did graduate. And I also was commissioned as an ensign in the United States Navy. So I was kind of on my way in that respect. Although, when I graduated, I didn't have 2 pennies to rub together.
But even as that ensign, nope, 2 penny didn't have 2 pennies rubbed together. You made it a point to make sure that you helped others. When did you do this whole thing of I understand you gave out close to 300 different scholarships to people to go to college?
Well, what changed my life, Montel, is very simple. It's a scholarship. So I started very early. In fact, when I first got a reasonable amount of money or something, I started with a scholarship program at Westchester Community College, a book program. And since then, I've continued to give scholarships since about 1990. It's been 30 years. And I have scholarships at 8 or 10 different institutions now, mainly the University of Rochester, but Harvard, and Denver, and Vermont, and Brunswick School, and all the schools my kids went to, and this whole schools I went to. And to me, if you don't give back, you miss one of the great satisfactions in life. I'll give you a simple example. A young lady who's one of my first scholarship students, who's now a PhD in optical engineering, and she's also a concert pianist and a concert violinist. She doesn't weigh 100 pounds. She stood up on a stage and said, "It wasn't for you, Mr. Hajim, I wouldn't be here." Well, that pays for everything. Pays for all the money I ever spent and so forth. But I expect about 300 scholarships now, and I left in my will, when both Barbara and I pass away, there'll be another 30 or 40 per year at Rochester. So I really want to support the engineering school with scholarship money. But it changed my life, and it does change people's lives. You give them, if a kid gets to be 16, 17, 18 years old, he or she has done the job. And the only problem is finance to get to college. That's where I really want to spend my money.
That's incredible. I mean, I can understand it. Feeling. And do you get to hear from a lot of the students that you've given scholarships to?
Oh, I got a letter the other day from a girl from Notre Dame, said, everything's going great, thank you. No, I get more than my share of praise and more than my share of satisfaction out of these kids. It really changes their lives. And I've got a half a dozen PhD students that are doing really well now. People are getting married and having children, and it's a great experience. I offer that to everybody. You can build buildings and start programs, but scholarship to me is the answer. And by the way, it's the answer to a lot of different problems in America today. In my golf club, we gave 2 academic scholarships for about 15 years. And about 5 years ago, we started giving vocational scholarships. We now give 10 vocational scholarships at my golf club. And, if you want to be a chef, it costs $40,000 a year at Johnson Wells. And
Right.
you should see the look on the kid's face we gave as Johnson Wells scholarship to last year. I mean, he just lit up. And I do believe one of the problems in America is that we need more vocational scholarships, because in my book, I talk about passions. If you have a passion for doing something, you don't have to go to college to do that. I think you can go to a school where they teach what you want to learn. And that can be being a chef, being a marine engineer, being a nurse, whatever it might be. And I'm involved in the Keys Community College down here in Florida as well, where they're training 60 nurses now. And I'm hoping to have a scholarship there as well.
Extremely interesting when you talk about the fact that when you look at the way America or our public school system is operating these days. I remember when I went to high school, vocational tech was there. There
Yeah,
were
I was too. You could take two channels. And the guys that went into commercial, as they called it, or vocational, did just as well as the people who went to college, or better.
absolutely, absolutely. But the key was getting some form of education post high school.
That my first thing is anything possible. The second thing is education is the solution to either everything or almost everything. Those are two messages I want to get across. And inclusion. My other message is never be a victim if you can help it. I think that's one of the things I find young people like me, they become victims and get distracted. They start blaming other people. Other people may be to blame. There's no two ways about that. But on the other hand, if you use your energy to figure out what's next, you got a better chance of being successful rather than hating somebody or blaming somebody or something. So I pitched that very hard, and my life is an example of that. When I was wrong, even though I failed, I didn't focus on that. I focused on what's next. And in one situation where I was absolutely right, and they threw me out anyway, I focused on what's next. And these are the messages I want to get across to young people, and I have examples of that in my life.
Yeah, I mean, the bottom line is you can be victimized, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to live out your life as the victim.
That's exactly right. And by the way, many specs, when you go on to what's next turns out to be better than what you were doing before. And that happened to me when I worked at Lehman Brothers. I did everything right. They still threw me out. And I found my dream job, which was being the CEO and chairman of a small investment bank, which really made me happy. And I spent 20 years there, and that's really my success.
How did you shift from engineering into banking?
I went to the Harvard school in Boston where they train people, and I started to find another passion, a passion basically of putting people together to accomplish a project, and didn't have to necessarily be engineering. Also, when I was an engineer, I found being an engineer wasn't that good a deal. I mean, I love being an engineer, but I watched people who were engineers after 20 years end up, having their science either be worthless, or the company decided they didn't want to do it. I had a whole group of water chemical guys working next to me when I was a plastics engineer. They just disappeared one day because the company didn't want to be. And also the technology, the people coming out of school were better than they were. So engineering seemed a little weak to me. But in business school, I found out my real passion was putting people together to accomplish a project and helping people do better than they thought they could. That's my real success. I mean, I really enjoy watching someone do better than they thought they could. And I think this is what really made me successful in business. And I love that. And I must admit, looking at the engineering job, which was very difficult, I looked at this finance job where, you got in a briefcase, got in an airplane, you went and visited the company, you came back, you write a report, you pick the stock. That seemed a lot easier than putting on a, white suit and, goggles and so forth, and going into a plant to figure out how to extrude plastic at the time. So it seemed like an easier job. And I sort of fell in love with that. I still wanted to start my own business, but I found when I went to Wall Street, or in this case, a money management company, I found that to be a fascinating experience. And you're always dealing with really interesting people. So I got caught in that. I mean, that was, and then also I felt that, first of all, Hercules, which was a company I worked for, was willing to give me $1,000 raise after I just spent $10,000 on school. And this company in California was willing to pay me $11,500 for the year. And I had a big debt at Harvard. So, I think there was enough balance that this was the answer. But I do believe in pivoting. And also, I believe your passions do change over time. Right now, you can see what my passion is. It's no
Absolutely.
longer business. It's conveying ideas to people, helping them get through the early bumps in life.
And that's really probably the reason why you wrote this book, The Island of Four Ps, a modern fable about preparing for your future. And they're very interesting. I mean, I've been through. I'll tell you honestly, I've not read the entire book yet. I'm about halfway through, and I jumped ahead a little bit, so make sure we could, do this interview today. But why did you pick this format? What resonated in you in telling the story in a fable way rather than just going directly for, because your four P's are incredible. We'll get to what they are, but why did you pick this format?
To me, first of all, the book is about conversation with yourself. There's a young man talking to an old man for the entire 3 hours that the book takes to listen to, or 3 or 4 hours to read. And I really want to get a vocabulary to that conversation. And I found that using a fable historically, it's more digestible, it's more universal. And this is not a book about right or wrong. I'm not telling you what to do, what not to do. I'm telling you how to do and to find out what you want to do. And I found a fable. You look at something like Who Moved My Cheese, or The Alchemist, or even Gulliver's Travels. These books become books that for forever. There are 1,000 books out there to tell you this is the right way or this is the wrong way to do things. I'm trying to give people a vocabulary to converse with themselves, and also converse with their friends and their family and their coworkers and their children and grandchildren. And I'm trying to get this vocabulary across, and I'm having these two people discuss it throughout the entire book. A young man who's seeking answers, and an old man is helping him find those answers, not giving him the answers. You notice my guide in the book is guiding. He's not giving his answers, and it's very important. So
Right.
I think the fable's fun. Also, I decided it'd be more fun to write a fable, and someday, it could be an animated film or something like that. That maybe, as I said one day, one person said this will be the first video game where nobody gets shot. But that's why I chose it. I started it and just sort of just kept going.
I think yeah, there is a definite app video game here, especially as you go through the villages. Let's break the book down a little bit for us. Tell us how you.
No, see, my mind, there's four parts of life: self, family, work, and community, which is my word for giving back. And I want to pour into those four parts of life passions, principles, partners, and plans. And I believe if you sit down and sort of say, what is my passions? What turns me on? What makes me get up in the morning? And that passion is an overused word. It includes talent, it includes interest, non-interest. Also, it's contextual. You have passions for certain periods of history. Then principles. What rules do I want to live by? What lines won't I cross? And those principles, by the way, they evolve. I just talked to you about one of my principles was, one of my passions was by helping people do better than they thought they could. One of the principles I developed was you can basically accomplish anything if you don't worry about who gets the credit. So I attached that principle to my passion. And I even go further than that. I start to deflect credit. But anyway, so that's principles. Now you've got passions and principles. Now whatever you decide to do, you have to have the right partners. Today, in my mind, it's vital. But more importantly, in my lifetime, I was only as good as the people I surrounded myself with. You'll find in my book that when I had the wrong partners or no partners, I failed. With the right partners, I succeeded. So I think partners are important. When you get all that done, you should write out your plan. And the fourth part of the book, it talks about writing a plan. It tells you all the different things you have to consider. Because what you really want to find when you write your plan, basically, is a wave or a cycle or a theme that's going to exist in your particular period of history. And you'll find almost any biography, you'll find out that successful people get the wind at their back at some part of their life. And so that I talk about that. I talk about the drivers of themes and waves. The government's a driver, technology is a driver, geography is a driver, the demographics are a driver. And I keep talking about those. And in the fable, this boy gets into a column and he spends a week in the column going through all these drivers. He goes through history. So he sees how history affects the drivers. And so it's this kind of sort of fable experience, which basically you go through. And in a sense, people look at history. And in my case, I took over an investment bank in 1983. It was a little tiny thing, 20 million revenues. 20 years later, we grew it 20 times. People say, Ed, you did a great job. Well, I did. But the stock market during that period was up 10 times. So I had the wind at my back. And I can go through a lot of examples of people that I've come across. A friend of mine is he does surgery on curvature of the spine, and instead of coming to the United States where there's demand for that, he went to Ethiopia, where he became one of two people in the whole continent that did what he did. After 30 years, he's changed so many lives. That was it. He found latent demand. He found an unsatisfied need. Well, those are the 4 Ps. And I want people to I want them to write them down. Write down your passions. Look at my passions. Changed. When I started a teenager, I think you sort of in your teenagers start to pick up their passions. I had math and science, baseball, basketball, and girls. And went into college. That morphed over into engineering and extracurricular activities, and then it morphed again into management. And you can watch that happen. And I think that's very important because in your lifetime, context changes. Some things that you might be passionate about disappear, and some other things appear. So that's what I want. And I want people to have that conversation with themselves. I think the inner voice is the only constant. And by the way, you talk to it all the time. I mean, on the golf course, you're always yelling at yourself for hitting bad shots, or you're thinking nasty thoughts about somebody you don't like and so forth. This conversation goes on, and most of your major decisions are made in this conversation with your inner voice. That's too much. My daughter says I always answer the question too long. I'm sorry, Montel.
No. I hear you, and I think it's one of the things I've spoken about for years is the fact that a lot of people don't take the time. It's one thing about the book that I did enjoy, and especially getting through the first couple of chapters is the fact that it forces you to, as you read the fable, to stop and take a break and reflect on yourself. One of the things you say is that you need to know what your passions are, but how do you know what you're passionate about unless you know who you are? And unfortunately, we've got this idea that you're crazy if you talk to yourself. Well, if you can't talk to yourself, then how can you talk to anybody else?
Anybody, exactly right. You
Well,
really have to learn to do that. No, but the passions you test. I thought I might be a physicist. So in my sophomore year, I took advanced physics course and blew out of there very quickly. I thought I wanted to be an international businessman. So I spent the year between years at business school in Belgium. And I figured that after I graduated, I spent a summer down in Central America. Found out that at 1964, international business was not a good place to be. So you test your passions to find out whether the word that it said, this is my passion. Well, let's test it. Let's see if it really is. And I did test it, and that's in the book as well. So I think that's important to young people. Give it a shot. If you think you're going to like something, do it. And I wonderful comparison in my first book, comparing an investment banker, which just sounds really good, to an analyst, which sounds bad. Turns out an analyst job was a lot better than an investment banker. It turned out for me anyway. So those are the kinds of things that I think you talk over with yourself and write down.
Absolutely. And that's one very important, I think, is to write it down so that it's something that you can go back and reflect on again and again. And as you said, those things change over time and change due to your circumstance.
Yeah. The Chinese medicine cabinet, with all the little drawers in it. I want to put a drawer with passions and keep putting stuff in there, and then go back and look at that and see what I said before, and say, is that true anymore? Because you're early when you're a youngster, you want to be an astronaut or a fireman, and it changes, and by the way, physically and mentally you change, and school changes you and so forth. So, and the same thing with principles. I had principles all my life. In fact, what I'm doing with you today was a total violation of my principle when I was on Wall Street. My principle on Wall Street was to live happy, was to live hidden. You would call me up, I'd say, we want to talk to you. No newspapers, no television, no radio. There were guys who did that, and that's fine. But because I didn't do that, I could concentrate on my people, concentrate on running the company. Because once you become a public figure, like I'm doing right now, this is energy. This takes a lot of energy. But I use that energy on my clients and on my people. And I refuse to be on television. I refuse to. In fact, I remember when I sold the company, what's his name? One of the guys from CNBC called me and said, "We like that on television." I said, how about tomorrow morning? He said, old news. I said, good. But this is the kind of, you add these principles, and I used to put them up on my wall, and I recommend people do that as well. As you start staring at them, you start living by them.
Absolutely. And the only way you get to do that is if you take the time, spend the time with yourself, understand what you what motivates you, understands what you like, understand what you gravitate towards, start digging deep and figure out why you made decisions that you made. I used to spend, I know you spent time in the service in the military, in the Navy. I spent a lot of time, I have a career in the military that spanned over 22 years, or about 22 years. And during my naval career as an officer, I spent a lot of time as a uh, on submarines and have about 300 days under the water. And I can remember, when you're under the water like that, and this is hatch to hatch. This isn't go under the water, pop up 5 days later. No, no, no. The hatch closes. 100 days later, the hatch opens and you go home. And there are times where you don't really even understand what the day is because you're right. You're living off a 24-hour clock. And so then there's a period of time when you get to go to sleep. And, the job that I did, I was a special duty intelligence officer. So in that job, I had to be awake whenever the captain was awake. I had to be on the on the bridge when the captain was on the bridge. I had to be standing there waiting to answer any of the questions that he had. And when he went to sleep, then I would go run in and jump under my bed, in my rack, and go to bed. And of course, you couldn't go to sleep immediately. And so I did a little exercise on every one of my submarine points. And I'm telling you, easily 70 days out of each one of them, where I literally would just try to pick a time. The first time I did it, I remember I said, let me see if I can remember what's the earliest memories of my life? And I'd sit there in that bed and I'd think about, do I remember things or do I remember things that people told me? No, I do remember things. As a matter of fact, I remembered, and this is going to sound a little crazy, but I couldn't have been more than 2 years old, 2.5 years old. And I remember distinctly, and one of my siblings confirmed this, that we used to live in this tenement brownstone in Baltimore. And in one of the biggest ghettos in Baltimore is a place called Cherry Hill. And our unit had a second floor. And so the bedrooms we only had 3 bedrooms or 2 bedrooms. My parents had a bedroom and the kids had a bedroom. And my sister slept in the living room. My brother slept in a bedroom upstairs. And I can remember being in a bunk bed, the top bed, and the window was at the foot of my bed. And I used to remember just having fun taking my bottle and throwing it out the window because I'm assuming I'm gonna have to go downstairs and get it, bring it back up. And I remember that. And then I also remembered at the same time that I fell out of that bed. And then I remembered a lot of the things. And so I go through and play those thoughts through first. But then as I got started having memories where I can remember doing things, I would question why I did certain things. 7, 8, 9 years old. Why did I do these things at that age? I knew better, but why did I do it? And I try to force myself to remember what took place at the time that I was, the one time that I went and remember, I'll never forget this. Probably the only thing I've ever took without permission was I grabbed about a bag of apples off of. I went up to somebody else's porch. They had a basket of apples up there, and I took a bag up there and grabbed 10 of them, ran out the street, got my buddies. We sat back in the back, bunch of these apples. Now, I got told don't steal. I was taught all those things. Why did I think that was something I needed to do? Why? Because when I remember the context, I remember I was trying to impress my friends. And at like age 9, why was it so important to me to impress them by doing something illegal? And set about my thought process going, you know what? That's the reason why from that point forward, and I never got caught. But I remember, 2 or 3 days later, these guys saying, why don't you go steal some more? Like, I didn't steal those. Well, yeah, you did steal those. And that solidified the thought that no, you can't steal. You can't take something from somebody else because when you do so, it made me think. It made me think through. And I did that, over the course of about 230 days underwater, doing that kind of analysis on myself to try to figure out where do I come from? How do I make decisions that I make in my life?
That's what in my book, the word self is almost the most important thing for young people. Exactly what you did is what I want them all to do. I want them to look at their genes, mom, dad, grandpa and grandpa, Uncle Harry, maybe Aunt Matilda, take those genes and then take their environment, their experiences, and interface those two. And that results in making them who they are. So if you're an only child and you grow up in one neighborhood, you're one kind of kid. I mean, even your genes are different. But if you're like I am, you grow up, you're one, number 6 out of 10, and you grow up in 17 different places, you're a different kind of kid. But you can change yourself by understanding, as you did, understanding what you did and why you did it. And therefore, but that's why I say for everybody, the end of the year, go someplace, walk along a beach for 2 or 3 days, look over the year. And every 3 years, I recommend a really deep dive. I don't recommend a deep dive every year because I don't want you to change things too much each year. I want you to give whatever you're doing a chance. But every 3 years, do a really deep dive on your passions, your principles. Do it on yourself. Do it on your work. Do it on your family. Because really, it's a juggling. Think about the 4 parts: self, family, work, and community. It's really a juggling act. By definition, to be successful, you got to focus. You focus on your work, your family, and yourself, and your community suffers a little bit, not a lot. If you over-focus on your work, sure enough, they will suffer. And we've seen that in my business at Wall Street. Guys get captured with the business and they lose their families, or they lose their own self. They get into all kinds of problems and they don't have time for community. So it's a juggling act. So at the end of the year, say, this year I spent too much time. I didn't spend enough time with my family. Now I'm going to basically send my wife flowers once in a while. I'm going to take her to dinner. I'm going to spend a little time with my oldest son, but just write that down. So when year starts to go by, you leave work a little bit early. But that's really a big juggling act. It really is. It's very important to recognize that almost by definition, balance doesn't exist. You're always out of balance to some extent. And when I became the chairman of the board of the University of Rochester, I shut my business down. It was a wonderful hedge fund that was doing well. And I said, whoops, if I'm going to do this, I can't do that. I learned it early on because I failed when I was in my 30s really miserably, and that's in the book. And I learned that basically you can't do too many things at the same time well. And so I found that I either got to focus on one or the other. And I decided in this case, it was time in my life to pivot away from making money and pivot into doing something that really paid big dividends, being involved in a school. And I think that's another one of those great things you have. By the way, I want to get back. You and I would both, I can get your vote. I'd put the draft back in. I think spending time in the service was one of the great experiences of my life.
Well, don't get me started because you get me started,
I know.
open that door, you go get trouble because I believe first off, freedom isn't free, and where we live, there's so many people here who have a misguided impression of what patriotism is. They have a misguided impression of what loyalty to our nation is. They don't understand that at all, and unfortunately, the examples that most of our young people have to look up to and elected officials, they have no idea what that oath meant that they took. And
No.
you can see it today.
This
I
is
will swear or affirm that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Doesn't
right.
matter what position you hold, when you start your oath of office, they all start that way. And people need to understand that, when it says against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that makes this bigger than just you. It's bigger than your opinions. It's about defending people who are of like mind in a country called America that has afforded people like yourself and your father and those opportunities that the rest of the world has always wanted to have a part of, right?
we we are the greatest country in the history of the world. We are the first time that minorities or people in poverty and so forth have possibilities. Think about England, the most prejudiced country in the world. Japan, China. Nobody gets along in those countries. We have created something so unique in the history of the world that you have to appreciate it. But people not being in the service, not being patriotic, not understanding America this is one of the problems right now. And I can't do it. I can't work on that. I have to work on taking that 17-year-old who's done the job and giving him the money to go on to get more education, whatever the education would be, because I can't take on too many problems either. But I really believe that's one of you hit on it. There's no understanding of what we've created as a country. I mean, it's just unbelievable. My story, I lived the American dream, and it's still available. In fact, there's more opportunity and less prejudice today than ever before. More scholarships, and they don't care now. Many people don't care where you came from. When I went to college, being from an orphanage was a really bad deal, and you couldn't get help. If you got help, you were a nutcase. You couldn't do that. I remember finally someone said, when my father died, I went to see a wonderful woman, and I said, I need help because he died suddenly, and I needed to solve it. It didn't bring closure. And she just did something wonderful. She said, okay, we're going to take a 6-month program. You're going to write your father letters. And guess what? You're going to write the letters back pretending you're your father. And you and I are going to meet every couple of weeks and go over those letters, and you're going to get the questions answered. And she solved the problem. It took about 6 months, but it was a real worthwhile experience because I had to ask him the questions I never got a chance to ask him. Although I didn't ask him about my mother. I didn't ask him about my mother, which was really funny.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about your father for just a second. Though now you stopped hearing from him, and you didn't hear from him for 30 years. How did you even know he
No,
passed
no,
away?
no. He came back in my life. I lost him when I was 15. Disappeared for about 2 or 3 years. Didn't come to my high school graduation. Came back in my life kind of when I went to college, but we never really got back together again. It was a peaceful coexistence. He visited me when my children were born, but he and I have falling out in the service. When I left the service, he was ballistic. Why should you leave the service? I was a lieutenant JG. I had good reports and so forth. And he said you should. Because when he left the service, that was the end of the best part of his life. Then when I left being an engineer and going to Harvard Business School, I took all the money in the world I had and went up there. They said, you're crazy. You got a great job as an engineer. You're doing really well. Why would you do that? Then the coup de grace was when I married Barbara. He was apoplectic. He said, that's absolutely a mistake. Turns out she looked like my mother. I mean, I never saw a picture of my mother, so it drove him crazy. Her family is from that part of the world that my mother was from. From Belarus. One of her parents came from Belarus. And so that drove him crazy that I had returned and he had negative things to say about my mother, which, he basically said she was a bad person, so forth. And when I did finally find her after 57 years, I had trouble deciding whether I want to meet her or not. But that's what put pretty bad falling out. He finally came before his death. He came back to understand that Barbara was a wonderful lady, but he never really accepted her, and that was unacceptable to me because we basically fell in love, and it's been a great. I mean, all my accomplishments, if there are accomplishments, having been married for 57 years and having 3 children and 8 grandchildren, nothing beats that.
Gotcha. I feel the same way about mine. And it wasn't until he passed that then you found out after you just talk about this, you discovered a bag of letters in the closet
But
that
yeah, when he died suddenly, he died of a heart attack in his car, and I went down to Florida and started cleaning out his apartment, and it was a big suitcase full of all my letters, and I started going through them, and I just couldn't go through them. So I packed the suitcase up and took it back to Connecticut and put it in the closet. And I was 37, 36 then. 24 years later, on a Sunday, the boss, my wife, said, we're throwing this suitcase out if you don't look at it. Thank God it was raining really hard that day, and I had nothing to do. So I started going through the suitcase, and I found a pack of the letters way at the bottom, were yellowed, and it turned out that my mother didn't die. So at 57 years, I thought she died. I told everybody she died. And so I hired an investigator. And in a few months, they found her in St. Louis. She was 81 years old. She had been married before. She actually had another son, which, by the way, she didn't tell the other son about me. That's another funny story. I'll get to that. Anyway, so we spent, I'd say 6 weeks deciding whether we wanted this possibly terrible woman to enter our life. I mean, I had a good job. I had friends. My wife and I were getting along. The kids were doing fine. Why should I bring this person in? But we decided we'd do it. And I gave her a call and said, give me a call. And we flew out there, and I rang the bell and I said, this is your son, 57 years late. And we turned out to have 12 years with her. She was a wonderful lady. She had a great sense of humor. And what I found out is that I wasn't all my father. I was half my mother. In fact, more than half my mother. They were very different. My father was a feeler and he wasn't a thinker. My mother was a thinker and not a feeler. She didn't have a lot of emotion. I mean, we didn't really cry until about 2 hours after we met. She's a very, very thoughtful woman anyway. So she tells her son, she calls him up and said, remember that brother you always wanted? I found him. So I met her. We spent 12 years together. And Barbara's mother, who was a little bit older, and Barbara's aunt, who was also the same age, the 3 90-year-olds had a good 10 years together, which was fun. And when she died at 93. She just stopped eating. She was never sick. She's just, well, it's too much. It's over. And so her mentality and her thought process. And so in addition, she rhymes. When people invite me to parties to rhyme, she rhymes. And this would have been a great PhD study if I would have done it. But then when I discovered I was a private person, I didn't tell anybody about her. So except my YPO forum group, I told, but very few people. I felt being private was very important to me. And this is why I'm having I'm not nervous about this anymore, because I feel I'm doing some good by telling people about my life.
And do you have a relationship with your brother?
Oh yeah, great relationship. He has 3 boys, and his wife and my wife are very close friends. He's about 15, 14 years younger. He's a doctor in Lexington, Kentucky. A very nice man. We play golf together, and we're different people, but we have the same mother, and so we get along very. We talk at least once every couple of weeks without that, and he visits me. He's in Florida as well sometimes. So
Wow.
it's and not having, I always say at my grammar school graduation, my high school graduation, my college graduation, my graduate school graduation, nobody came to it. Nobody. Now I have a family. We go away. We're 16 close family. Then I have my brother, and his 3 kids, and they have kids, and so I'm a monster family now. I mean, it's really kind of unusual. Starting with one, I was all alone, and now I have this wonderful family. It's a great story. I mean, I
It's
almost don't believe it myself.
such a great story. And again, the book is called The Island of the Four Ps, Modern Fable About Preparing for Your Future. What other wisdoms do you think that people can glean from this book?
Well, the first 3 are very important. Anything is possible. I've proven. In fact, I didn't even describe my size. When I entered high school, I was 4'10", and I weighed like 75 pounds. So I was diminutive. Kids used to pick on me and so forth. I was kind of funny looking in addition. But anything's possible. Second is education is the solution to almost everything. And education will be something that you want to do. And then third is don't be a victim. Use your energy to find out what's next and pursue it. And then the wisdom is the 4 Ps. Develop a conversation with yourself and collect that and write down things so you can look at them and periodically review them. Also, recognize that you're in a context. I mean, I don't blame my father. Think of somebody born in 1990, 1900. Think about, by the time you're 14 years old, we're in a First World War. Then you have the Spanish flu. You get a few good years in the 20s, although they're crazy. Then you lose everything. Then you have the Second World War. The 60s weren't simple, and the 70s were terrible, inflation and so on. So you're 70 years old. You haven't had a great run of it. Look at my life. I mean, sure, it was kind of tough till the 70s, but starting in 1983, we've had 40 of the greatest years in the history of the world. So you're in a context, and that's very important to recognize. So those are some of the messages, but you have to find out who you are, what you want to live by, what kind of partners you want. And by the way, finding someone to love is so important. Finding a partner for life that can support you, you can support her or him or whatever it is. It's very important. And find someone who you can basically trust. And I think that's very important. But partners are also in today's world. There's very few jobs that you can do without partners. And I say that I have very definite partners. I have a partner that can do things I can't do. I want partners that can do things that better than I can do them. Then this unusual partner, which nobody talks about, finding partners that do things you do really well that you don't want to do. You get those 3 kinds of partners, either in one person or with 3 people or 5 people. You end up doing things you do well that you want to do. I ran into a guy in my early career named Steve Fletcher. He did all those other things. And he and I spent 35 years together. And without him, I would never have been successful. He took all the burden off me, do things that I really didn't want to do. I mean, being a CEO of an investment bank, every week somebody was in from the IRS, the SEC, the NASD, or God knows what other kind of 3-letter agency. He took care of all that. I was able to spend my time managing the company.
Now, are you on social media? Can people find you if they want?
And again, given the fact I'm only a private person, I stayed off social media. But now, since I'm involved now, I've joined LinkedIn, and I've joined not just LinkedIn. I'm still staying off social media. My publicist is pushing me to be more involved, but It's something I just haven't gotten used to. Also, it requires a certain amount of time. My wife is on Facebook, so I get almost a daily report of what's going on. So,
Gotcha. Well, anything else you want to share, my friend?
I just want to say, people ask me, how are you? And at my age, you give them an organ recital. This hurts and that hurts. All I say is I'm grateful. I really am grateful. I'm grateful to my family, to the schools who trained me, to the United States of America. And I think that people have to be grateful. This is still the greatest country in the history of the world, and I'm living proof of that. And I think that everybody's got a shot now. And I guess the only thing else I'd like to share is that, I'm really wonderfully surprised and appreciate people like yourself who spend time searching out people like me, because I'm not a celebrity, and I get a chance to put my book out to people, and it's giving me an enormous amount of satisfaction when I see young people at universities read it and come away saying, "Oh, they get one idea, it's worth it to me." Thank
Absolutely.
you.
No, sir. Well, thank you. And thank you for sharing with our audience. I mean, I'll tell you, people here free thinking are just that. They're free thinkers and they're always looking for an opportunity to expand themselves. So thank you, Ed. And anytime, if you want to come back sometime to share some more, we'd love to have you.
Thank
Um,
you.
Success and with this book, I hope it does really well. And I'll do it one more time. I like to do the shameless plug, you know what I mean? But that's a book itself right there again.
And by the way, we did an audible of it.
Oh,
And
that's
it's
great.
six voices, six voices. The gal did a spectacular job, and it's really fun. It listens to in 3 hours, so that's going to come out too.
It's the island of the four P's, a modern fable about preparing for your future. Thank you so much, Ed Hajim, for being here. I just said it right. No, I got it right. All right. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you, Montel.
And I can't wait to see you again. And I want to make sure all of you tune into the next edition of Free Thinking with Montel. Thanks for joining me on Free Thinking with Montel. Please make sure you're subscribed and hit the bell to be notified when new episodes post each week. We'd love to hear feedback, so please send us your comments.